Okay, well, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's John Preedy Memorial Lecture. As many of you will know, who've been involved in Friends of the Earth for many years, John Preedy was an inspirational environmental activist who very sadly was killed in a cycling accident in his late 20s. This was back in the 1980s. And to honour his memory, we've been having an annual lecture in his name every year since. And in doing that, we remember the contribution he gave and indeed just how powerful environmental activists can be at that local level. Every year we get a top speaker to talk to us about one of the key issues of the day. And I'm absolutely delighted that this year we're welcoming Shami Chakrabarti. Shami will be known to all of you, I'm sure, in her role of having led the campaigning organisation Liberty for the last 12 years. And she's known very well as a staunch campaigner and defender of human rights. We thought it was really appropriate to invite her to come and speak this year, because in the last 2 to 3 years in particular, there's been extraordinary attempts really to try and shut down campaigning, make it harder and harder to campaign on all kinds of issues. As you know, I've been in the post of Chief Exec at Friends of the Earth for just 11 months, and I can tell you I've had to spend a huge amount of time the last 11 months just defending us from attacks, whether they be by the Charity Commission, the Electoral Commission, or in newspapers or by government and legislation to make it harder and harder to campaign. So it's an absolute delight to be able to welcome Shami today. She's going to be speaking to us about campaigning for a safe, free world. Shami.
Well, thank you, friends of the Earth. I can't tell you what a privilege it is to give this talk and have this discussion, I hope, in John Preedy's name. But also, there was something that put a smile on my face about getting on a train in London this morning and going to a place called Hope to speak to Friends of the Earth. So, that in itself is a sort of positive memory that I'll keep with me for a very long time. But be afraid. I mean, you've heard the sort of charming introduction, but I think you should be very afraid because the Sun newspaper once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. Look at me. Britain must be a lot safer than people think. And you can imagine what a great icebreaker that has been. So for the last more than 12 years, travelling up and down the country, speaking to very different audiences, young and old, legal, artistic, you name it, talking to people about human rights, particularly during the War on Terror, and wonderful to be able to begin with that little flourish. Be afraid, be very afraid. The Sun newspaper once called me the most dangerous woman in Britain. But it's equally been fascinating to gauge people's responses. Yours was pretty good, by the way. But in some places it's a sort of slightly embarrassed titter. But I have to say that the closer you get to the great city of Liverpool, the greater the likelihood of a standing ovation before you've even begun. Anyone from Liverpool in the tent? I was going to say in the house, but in the tent would be a better thing to say. And I was once giving a talk in Derry, Londonderry, about civil liberties during the War on Terror, and I did the same, most dangerous woman in Britain, and there was a slightly nervous, hesitant laugh. And afterwards, over the very smart drinks in the Guildhall, an immaculately dressed woman of a certain age came up to me very warmly, and forgive the poor attempt at an accent, but they only said you were the most dangerous woman in Britain. I really was. And it was a great joke. I was slightly nervous, as back to, being that swotty girl at school, behind the bike sheds, and a hard girl has come to give you a talking to. But and she went on to tell me about her, her conviction and imprisonment for, conspiracy to cause explosions, etc., etc. But by this point, she was an elected politician in the Stormont Assembly with policing responsibilities, and part of, an attempt at peace and progress and justice in that part of the world. And I think that's quite a significant place to begin, because it's very easy to get depressed about the state of the world, and goodness me, it's a very strange and scary place at the moment when I think about some of the challenges that we face. But I try to remember the positives as well. When I was a child, I don't think I ever thought I would live to see the fall of the Berlin Wall or liberation in apartheid South Africa or relative peace in Northern Ireland, or, goodness me, same-sex marriage promoted by a Conservative Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, even, having to piss off his right flank, and delivered by a people's referendum in the Republic of Ireland. And yet all these things came to pass, and not just a little bit due to people's activism and campaigning and the building of broad movements that in the end powerful elites just couldn't ignore anymore. So I think it's important not to be too pessimistic. Angry enough to take action, but optimistic enough to be consistent with it and ultimately make it succeed. And this is not something that's always come particularly naturally to me. I can remember speaking to an audience in Bristol some years ago about all the terrible things that were being perpetrated in the name of the war on terror. Do you remember that? The war on terror, the war against an abstract noun that designed to create a permanent emergency so that we would all give up our rights and freedoms happily, not for a finite period of war, but forever. Right? Mr. Rumsfeld called it the new normal, the long war. Yeah. So I was running around the country telling people that it was all going to hell in a handcart, and they really needed to get exercised about things like ID cards and extraordinary rendition. There's another beautiful euphemism, extraordinary rendition. For those of you who were newly born, that is not beautiful singing or great wall plastering. There's amazing evil genius euphemisms for unspeakable things, right? War on terror, extraordinary rendition. Waterboarding was not a seaside sport. It was not, I wish they could all be California. And there is actually a little lesson there, isn't there, for campaigning about the war of words, which is, the bad guys do it. We can do it too. When I was a relatively new and youngish director of Liberty, one of our big campaigns, good campaign involved people's activism and petitions and demonstrations, but also litigation, crucially, and media work and so on, was against indefinite detention without charge or trial in Belmarsh prison. It was kind of Mr. Blair's act of solidarity with Mr. Bush's internment of people in Guantanamo. And the government thought they could get away with this, both legally and politically, because everybody who was so interned post 9/11 was a foreign national. And therefore, this indefinite detention without police charges, police arrest or charge, let alone trials, this could be done in the name of immigration detention, administrative immigration detention. And the argument was, well, these people are all foreigners, but we can't deport them to their home countries because they would be tortured there. And that wicked old convention on human rights stops us sending people to places of torture, so we will detain them instead in what we call a three-walled prison. Because you are, of course, free to leave at any time if you want to go and take your chances with the torturers back home. That was literally the submission that was made by Lord Goldsmith on behalf of the Blair government in court in the House of Lords. It was a long and painful campaign, very bitter. But the interesting thing was that the government started out calling this practice immigration detention or administrative detention. All these very technical, boring, dry terms that sort of rub out the imagination and the empathy of the people we're trying to reach as campaigners. We at Liberty called it internment. Plain and simple from day one. Internment, internment, internment. And so the newspapers picked that up. And so the debate was framed in our favour. And it's kind of halfway to winning, isn't it, when you frame the language and the terms of the debate. And, you know, by the time that piece of litigation got to what was then the House of Lords, it's now the Supreme Court, even the Attorney General himself appearing on behalf of the Blair government called it internment. More recently, we've had this with the Snoopers Charter. You know, this is the blanket surveillance that Edward Snowden rumbled, and so the government now wants to retrospectively legislate to make it all legal. And they call it, you know, they've got some investigatory powers, draft investigatory powers bill, blah, 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 blah. Open brackets, close brackets. Let's make it as technical and boring as possible. And of course, we call it the Snoopers Charter, because that's what it is. It's a blank cheque for blanket surveillance, not against individual people who are suspected of doing wicked things, but against entire populations. And you as dangerous radical people will know that blanket arbitrary investigation of that kind will always lead to the targeting of individuals, but not on the basis of reasonable suspicion, on the basis of what? Race or politics or dissent. So we call it the Snoopers Charter, and now poor old Mrs. May spends a lot of her time saying, this is not a Snoopers Charter. A little angel gets her wings every time the Home Secretary says, this is not a Snoopers Charter. What is it not, Home Secretary? Say that one more time for me. This is not a Snoopers Charter. So that was a little ramble about words, but you'll appreciate I have no PowerPoint, I have no explosions to set off, you know, no gimmicks or stunts. Words are incredibly important in campaigning, I think, and it was ever thus. And I'm trying to keep positive because I was once in Bristol during the War on Terror talking about all these wicked things, ID cards, rendition, stop and search without suspicion, all these things that were passed in the Blair years and to some extent in the Brown years before the wonderful Civil Liberties Coalition that turned into what we have now. And I gave this talk, and at the end of it, a woman in the audience, she was very kind to me. She didn't take me on in public, but she came to the stage at the end of the talk, and she said, Shami, that was incredibly informative, and I learned about all these terrible things that are being done in my name, but do please remember that Martin Luther King never said, I have a nightmare. And I thought that was rather good advice that I haven't always taken on board, but I try to. Because, of course, we need to get the information, the terrible information out there, that we need to be informed in order to be active, but not so depressed that we can't get out of bed and we don't think there's a point to be involved. So I think that's a crucial balance that we all have to strike. It's not always easy when trying to engage the uninitiated. And so I know that you've done incredible work in Friends of the Earth, and you know the power of activism at a local, regional, national, and international level, and you will therefore know why the powerful don't like it. And I have to say that I think this moment is a particularly nasty, ideological, spiteful moment in British politics. in terms of trying to shut down checks and balances and dissent at every turn. I've seen a lot, and I've moaned even more, but I haven't seen anything quite like this full frontal assault on any other rival centres of not even power, but of voice and dissent. Really quite extraordinary. It didn't just happen yesterday. I think that the pieces were being put into place some years ago with the undermining of legal aid, with the trashing of lawyers and judges and activists and others. You know, that slightly sneering tone that has been taken by those in power for a long time. But goodness me, it's a very special moment now. It's a shameless moment, really, in terms of, you know, not the, I can't say the decimation of legal aid, because that suggests 1 in 10 people won't get it. I'm talking about the virtual obliteration of civil legal aid, which also has a relevance for the environmental movement. And I'm talking about Mr. Grayling's full frontal attack on judicial review and on people like us who see the law not as a tool for, you know, defending power and property and vested interests, but as a tool of justice, including social justice. And so we've been told that judicial review, which is, in plain English, how we use the law to hold powerful public authorities to account. We're told that this is just being used by wicked old charities and NGOs for their own purposes. Charity is no longer a good thing, apparently, in modern conservative Britain. Strange thing, because I thought charities were supposed to deliver the big society that was going to pick up all the pieces after the dismantling of the state. But I think I missed an episode of this particular of Downton Abbey. That's kind of what it is, isn't it? You can tell what's going on in the country by, you know, when I was a kid it was all Brideshead Revisited, and then TV got a bit more interesting, and now it's all Downton Abbey, and, you know, the Lord is in his manor, and some wicked dissenters in the kitchens, you know. Anyway, you don't want to hear me talk about TV. And, of course, we see the lobbying legislation that has been geared, quite deliberately geared, to stop there being civil society voices in political debate. Extraordinary attack on freedom. Extraordinary attack on parliamentary democracy. The idea that politicians are the only people who are allowed to speak during a period of elections. And we're called political even if we're not campaigning for a particular candidate, for or against a particular candidate, or for and against a particular party. I came across this last summer at Liberty. Last summer, in the run-up to that general election, where we wanted to keep on doing what our job is at Liberty, amongst other things, to defend the Human Rights Act. For years, the Charity Commission advice was, well, of course, you know, campaigning for human rights is a charitable objective. That was the line for years. But all of a sudden, no, we have this lobbying legislation, and one party in the game wants to dismantle human rights, and therefore you are rendered political. I'm sorry, who started playing politics with human rights? It wasn't me. But one party decides that it's the manifesto pledge to scrap the Human Rights Act, potentially pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. And so those of us who want to keep doing our work, I know, I feel the same way. It's a travesty! We are rendered political by their political act. I won't respond. Sometimes you have to, you know, not respond. So there's no doubt in my mind that the lobbying legislation has had a chilling effect on trade unions, on charities, on NGOs, at, you know, that most crucial moment in any electoral cycle, in any democracy, which is the election moment, when people should be airing all sorts of views about all sorts of contentious issues. And I know that you are really leading the campaign against that legislation. I think it's wonderful to hear that. that you're seeing the bigger picture, friends of the earth, that understanding that to fight climate change you have to achieve political change ultimately. You cannot separate environmental justice from rights and freedoms and people's justice. And I, began to think about this some years ago when I was warned that as climate change becomes more and more of a chronic problem, people will resort to more and more inward-looking authoritarian policies. They will turn on each other. They will turn on the climate change refugees, and they will turn to less education and enlightenment and harsher penalties in relation to environmental policy. But that has yet to be my experience, and I have instead noticed very strong resonances and symmetries between our two movements, if I can put it like that, between the human rights and green movements. And I wonder why that is. And I think when I reflect on it, the ultimate resonance is empathy and justice and imagination and ultimately generational justice, thinking about the next generation. A lot of people don't do that, or they choose not to do that. They choose to look the other way because to think about the future is just too frightening. And so they choose to put the future away, lock it in another room, and it won't be my generation, it'll be my kids or my grandkids, or I don't have kids, or whatever it is that gets people through the day not to care about the planet. It's the same instinct that stops people thinking about desperate refugees drowning not in some faraway ocean, but in the Mediterranean, where British holidaymakers used to happily splash. And I think ultimately that's what links these two movements: imagination, empathy, and a care for legacy, a care for generational justice, and for the humans, not just the humans of today, but the humans yet to come, and resistance to complacency and selfishness and so on. But we are not alone. I've never been of the view that I'm so special and so clever that if I have values, I'm going to have them to myself. I've never been of that view, and that's never been my experience. And I think that the Green Movement is a great case in point, and the rise of the Green Movement, which I'm sure will only continue as the evidence becomes just more and more inescapable, and to some extent, I'm sorry to say, the crisis more chronic. But the good news is young people. The good news is internationalism. The good news is empathy and imagination. We are social creatures. We just are. We're amazing, precious individual creatures, capable of doing all sorts of extraordinary things in our heads and with our heads, but we are ultimately social creatures too. And in political and social life, we find words for that, like solidarity and community and fellowship, and different cultures and faiths have words for it in the social sphere, because there's something about us that wants to come together and do this. And do this. Even in the 21st century, when we could all just be sitting on smartphones instead, in our little cubby holes, we choose to do this. We are social creatures. And then that empathy, that imagination comes to life in our more intimate life as well. And we call it family, we call it friendship, we call it love. But it's all coming from the same place of empathy that, when combined with evidence and logic and science and storytelling, can actually make for great movements and broad coalitions and breathtakingly successful campaigns, I think. So a few final thoughts on campaigning before perhaps we open this up for some discussion, some questions or comments, or my favourite, by the way, which are comments very thinly disguised as questions. Do you know what I mean? You do that here too, don't you? Yeah. And in case you're new to this, what you do is you have a very long rant, and then at the end you say, "Don't you think?" Or possibly, if you're very skilled, you just raise your voice at the end of the sentence as if you're French or Australian or something like that. You don't even have to do that, "Don't you think?" So we'll do that in just a moment. But I think a great campaign, well, even a great campaigning movement begins with its principles, and no question. You begin with your principles, and then the painful part, the choosing of priorities. That's the most painful part. So much injustice to go around, limited resources, an attempt to leverage power and to make an impact. So the choosing of priorities, very painful, and it doesn't. You're not really doing it unless it hurts. It's not just saying yes; it's saying no, and saying no to a lot of people that need your help and support. And so, but I do think it's essential to ultimately effective campaigning, and then of course your planning, and these wonderful choices, creative choices to make between the use of evidence and on the one hand, and the use of storytelling on the other, that combination or choice that we sometimes really, really interesting. And I've seen it work both ways. Sometimes just some bald statistics will jump off the page. Sometimes it's a story. It's an individual human story, and you have that palette really to choose from as a campaigner. And then, of course, we talk to and with our friends and build coalitions of friends, and hopefully petitions and movements and marches of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people. But don't forget the unusual suspects. They're really good value in campaigning. So in the whole kind of war on terror piece, some of the greatest advocates of human rights have come from very unlikely quarters. So, for example, when we were campaigning against detention of terror suspects for 42 days without charge, not without trial, but without charge. Imagine being arrested. Do not pass go. Do not collect £100. Go to the cell and sit there for 42 days, and then we might charge you with something. That was the policy, and that was a very hard fought campaign. But the moment I thought we might have won it as when I heard not Dame anymore, by then Baroness Eliza Manningham Buller make her maiden speech in the House of Lords. She stood up. It's all in my little book. My 14-year-old calls it a short book with large font. It's called On Liberty. The white middle-aged male libertarians went ballistic. How dare you? But it was a joke. But anyway, humour is quite important in campaigning too. Sometimes, by the way. She rose to her feet. It was her maiden speech, 2008, in the House of Lords. People didn't know what she was going to say, surely. The former Queen of the Spooks is going to make us all incredibly afraid and tell us why people should be locked up with the key thrown away in scary, difficult times. And she said that she'd not been in their lordship's house for very long. She didn't know all the traditions, but she'd been told that a maiden speech should be short and uncontroversial. She said, "Short I can do. Controversial is going to be a little trickier." Don't you love that English understatement? And then she went on to say that arguments could be made for any length of time of pre-charge detention, just as they could be made for any method of interrogation. But she was against 42 days, and it was literally an ooh-ah moment in the House of Lords, and I felt that was a pivotal moment in our campaign. Unusual suspects, unlikely friends at home and abroad, and I suspect there'll be many of them in the cause of Friends of the Earth as well. People from even the political right and so on and so forth. People who've changed their minds, perhaps. I don't know. You'll know better than me. Internationalism. This is a shrinking, interconnected world. More and more, I think we need to, and we can, thanks to the internet, this wonderful new campaigning tool, reach out and build broad international coalitions to do our work. And ultimately, I just want to be positive and to really thank you for your work, for having that imagination and not locking the door and doing what you do on behalf of all of us, really, and our children and grandchildren, all those generations yet to be born. And I believe that your work will pay off. How can it not? I'm no longer the director of Liberty. You know, everyone has to hang their megaphone up in the end. Perhaps not before time in my case. But I think what did it for me was having enjoyed being the most dangerous woman in Britain for all those years. In the run-up to last year's general election, the Daily Mail newspaper, it would be, wouldn't it, had to spoil it for me by saying that the most dangerous woman was now a charismatic politician north of the border. And to add insult to injury, the First Minister of Scotland's a little bit younger than me as well. But despite being a nationalist, has spoken up for the UK Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights, refused point blank to do any deals with the Conservative government that would allow, you know, Scotland to have its own Bill of Rights and England to dilute its, you know, and that gives me great heart. So to end once more with Martin Luther King, he once famously said, "The arc of history is a long one, but ultimately it bends towards justice." Thanks for listening.
Shami, thank you so much. Fantastic speech. And I know there'll be lots of people wanting to ask questions. So let's get into it. And we never do that thing that you were describing about comments disguised as questions. Honest. Okay, so Stuart.
Thank you very much. That's very inspiring. I wanted to ask you very briefly, you talked about hope at the beginning. You also talked about threats to our liberty and declining liberty prospects. In 5 years' time, if we were then, what would give you hope that actually that trend has been reversed and our liberty prospects for liberties are enhanced?
Shami.
Forgive me, but I've just affiliated for the first time in my adult life. I'm not cross-party, non-party anymore, so I think a change of government would be quite a good thing. Sorry, I couldn't resist. But that said, there are hawks and doves on liberty everywhere. Just as I suspect, you know, that there may be on environmental issues too, and it's very important to work with those bipartisan coalitions. In terms of, you know, what would be a test, what would show that we'd made progress on rights and freedoms. Proposition number one, we would still have our Human Rights Act, and we would have defended it with such a successful, resounding campaign that hands were off it at least for another generation. That would be a good sign. We would have new online surveillance legislation, but it would not be what's currently on offer. And in particular, it would go back to the principle of targeted surveillance, and it would introduce the principle of judicial sign-off before people's privacy can be intruded on in such an intimate way. You know, privacy protection in this country, and this is incredibly important for all activists, I think, because the Greenpeace women, goodness me, demonstrate, do they not? As does the story of Doreen Lawrence, the way that activists will become targeted by abuses of surveillance power and police power. You know, we live in a country where if I want to search your premises, I go to a magistrate and I get a warrant, unless it's an emergency. But if I want to tap your telephone in the conventional sense, then I can get a Home Secretary or Foreign Secretary's warrant. But if I want to put an undercover police officer in your campaign movement, in your friendship circle, in your home, in your bed. In your bed, there is literally no sign-off outside the police force required whatsoever. And the police to this day do not accept that that kind of, that basically sleeping with people, pretending to be somebody that you're not and having intimate relationships with them and fathering their children, they still do not accept that that is illegal per se. So I think we could have some better privacy legislation, both online and offline. I would just remind you that lots of young people and therefore young activists these days are living far more intimately in the online space than even sitting on the hay bale like an old lady like me. And the online world is the world where it's all happening for them. It's to put them under online surveillance is a much more intrusive thing than possibly even going into the bedroom and some smelly socks and whatever. It's the online world, the smartphone, the laptop, whatever, is going to reveal pretty much everything about somebody's life, including their health problems, their finances, their politics, it goes on and on. So we would have better protections in that area if we were making real progress in 5 years' time. And to go back to the earlier discussion, we would have defeated this lobbying legislation. And there's no reason why we shouldn't. And I think we'll have to do it by making people more aware. It's far too technical. It's far too boring. And it needs to be sexed up, frankly, so that people understand what's happening. Because it seems like a very boring, regulatory, dry kind of charity commission type thing. But people need to know what a chilling thing it is. And people remember that the general public do have a fondness for charities and NGOs that they don't actually have necessarily towards politicians. But it's sometimes hard for a sector to stand up for itself. This is how legal aid went down the Swanee. Because even, campaigning legal aid lawyers who are really good at standing up for their clients found it very hard to voice what needed to be said about the importance of legal aid, because it felt like you're just defending your own purse or whatever. So I think that's something to think about in relation to this particular campaign.
Natasha?
Okay, from an international perspective, really, we've seen it's not just the UK that's hardening up on lobbying and those kind of things. It's a lot of countries around the world, including a lot of countries in Africa and places that sometimes look to the UK for leadership. Where do we fall? Are we getting worse catching them up, or are we actually sort of following the trend around that? And is there a space for us to show leadership if we can get this push back against this?
We're going down. We are getting a lot worse. We are setting a very bad example, and our government doesn't care. However, we can turn this to our advantage, and I would be suggesting that we bring in voices from elsewhere in the world, even from places less free, to voice their concern about what's happening in Britain. That's I've seen that be a successful thing before, because it can shame governments, particularly. You can do it publicly, but you can also do it via other countries and ambassadors and so on. I've seen that work to some extent before. So that's the way to turn a rather shameful moment in our political history into hopefully a more positive one.
Okay, and do you want to go to Andrew, please?
And a straightforward question, I'm afraid. You were very kind about the Green Movement and Friends of the Earth, but when you look at us, what do you think we could do better?
In terms of decades, in terms of progress over the decades, I think in my life, I've seen the environmental movement just really happen, and I've seen the change in attitudes. It just needs to be speeded up, doesn't it? And it needs to have attraction. It needs to have greater traction, I suppose, in Westminster and Whitehall, and needs to be more mainstreamed. I would guess one needs to look to opposition parties, not just to opposition parties. It needs to. I think someone like Caroline Lucas has been a fantastic parliamentarian, and I think, as I'm now someone who's joined a different party to her. I just think about why there can't be a Labour Party that has a place for Caroline Lucas in it, which raises all sorts of questions about single issue parties versus broad movements. I would say that the challenge for the Green movement is to really fully mainstream, so that this is just a no-brainer. And I think for lots of kids, my son's 14, I think for lots of people of his generation it is almost a no-brainer, but there are lots of vested interests in older elites that find reasons not to make it such. But yeah, it would be the mainstreaming, the ultimate mainstreaming that makes the difference. And that has to, because we have to force powerful elites to do things that are against their interest. And I guess they'll only do that when they're really scared that their interests are going to be challenged if they don't.
Angela Needham, Hull, Friends of the Earth, Hull, Amnesty, Hull, Green Party. I'll make this a question.
No, carry on.
Why would anybody think that the Green Party is in any sense a single-issue party? We have been a mainstream, all-issues party for at least 4 decades, so why would we think otherwise?
I feel I've been thoroughly told, quite right to. So I guess that's an ignorant outsider's perception. However, in politics, ignorant outsiders' perceptions turn general elections, and therefore they are important. I put it no higher than that. I put it no higher than that, and it's not. I'm not having a pop at the Green Party. I think the Green Party's done some wonderful work, and I have huge respect for people like, especially Caroline, who I think is a wonderful parliamentarian and has been a great defender of human rights in Parliament, and Natalie Bennett as well. But there's now a new thing called the Women's Equality Party, for example. Let's leave the Green thing out of it. So there's something called the Women's Equality Party, and look, I was director of Liberty for 12 years. I worked there for 14 years. It was my thing. I didn't think of it as a single issue pressure group, but because human rights are so important. But we didn't campaign on social and economic rights, for example. And my neighbours in South London now go to food banks. And when I grew up in the 80s, I don't remember food banks in Thatcher's Britain. So I understand the important, and I said before, in campaigning you have to have priorities and you have to say no to things, and etc. But I also believe in broad-based political movements, and I've got dear friends in the Women's Equality Party, but I don't think that is the way to achieve women's equality or equality. I mean, I don't know. These are things that we can all debate. These are tactics, not principles. How to achieve change, how to build a broad-based movement for change, and even if we are in different groups or different parties, how in the end, between us, we will all come together to take on some of the great injustices and powerful interests in the world.
Thank you for a very inspirational speech. I must say, as a foreigner, I'm just very impressed by the way you speak, your vocabulary and everything. It's just beautiful. So, really true. You talk about justice. Of course, that's essential. Justice between human beings, justice between generations, and also justice for the planet. And I wonder whether I'm sure you're aware of the campaign to make ecocide a crime by, she's a solicitor, I think herself, Polly Higgins, yeah? She's been running this campaign for a long time. What do you think of this campaign, and what are your ideas, what are your thoughts of making ecocide a crime enshrined in law?
I don't think I know enough about the particular campaign and the particular formulation of the offence. I'll say this, over the years on human rights platforms, people have occasionally asked me about a rights-based approach for the environment. Could we attribute, I suppose it's a bit like attribute animal rights or plant rights, or why not attribute a kind of right rights-based approach to things other than humans. And I don't have a very strong philosophical view on that, but from a sort of tactical campaigning point of view, I think that humans relate best to humans, and that's why, for me, the key to the environmental piece is to think about generations of humans, probably. But that, I could be wrong about that, but that's just, I think, how you will motivate more people to engage with things like climate change. It just feels real and tangible and relatable when it's, we can't even relate to other people's children, let alone to, desperate people drowning in the Mediterranean, let alone attribute rights to a beautiful forest or whatever. So why don't we attribute the rights to the people who are being dispossessed of their beautiful forest? That's not a principled argument. It's a tactical argument to achieve what we want to achieve, I think. But that said, there should be crimes, and there should be law, and there should be crimes relating to the poisoning and destruction of the environment. Whether there's sides or not, there should be penalties in egregious cases. But I'm not the fan of the crime of the person who put the recycling in the blue bag instead of the green bag. I'd rather go for big business and the decimation or obliteration or envirocide of the planet, as you suggest.
Gentleman here.
Hi, I'm going to resist the temptation to talk about whether or not the Labour movement is worthy of Caroline Lucas.
Don't resist. Don't resist.
No. I have a question which I think is possibly deeper and maybe applies to the whole of the left in this country and its history. I just wonder. There are all sorts of arguments about this supposed issue of anti-Semitism on the left. Okay. I'm just wondering whether, given that a lot of it is clearly a put-up job and all the hypocrisy that is associated with the what I would see as clear Islamophobia on the right, do you feel personally that this is a spectre that is worth us taking the trouble to exercise once and for all so that we can get on with discussing the real issues?
But I'm not sure I should really talk about that, should I? Because I've got this summer job. So here's the thing. So I was at Liberty for 14 years, and I finished. I finished earlier this year. I finished on the 31st of March and was all gate happy. And I thought, I'm going to have this fantastic summer, or possibly even a gap year. Why not? Why not? And then on the 29th of April, I didn't even have a month off because I had lots of legacy speaking engagements. So I was going to Ireland and to see friends, and literally the phone rang, and so now I'm chairing an inquiry into all the things that you're talking about, which will report at the end of this month. And so I probably shouldn't say too much about it, other than I think it's important, and if it weren't important to lance this boil and deal with this, I wouldn't be doing it. And it's not a fake thing; it's a real thing. And if we get it right, then we can get on and talk about the food banks and the desperate people drowning in the Mediterranean.
Hello, I'm Teresa from London, Francia. When you mention you should be actually very depressed about things, I often think, well, yeah, I've got depressed about the environment, and but then I pick myself up and say, right, the next minute, a member of the government or someone does something very silly, says something very silly, and they show themselves up for what they are. So what I'm asking is that have you thought of something that's happened in that way that you can show that in a fun way, because that's the way to treat it in that sense, I think.
I know, I always say that. I say, we need more humour, but I'm just so humorless, aren't I? Just listen to me. It's all grit. But you're right, of course. You're right, we should use humour, and we should sometimes, we should use satire and humour, and where are those great TV shows that we used to have in the 80s? The older members of the audience are sort of nodding with me, but you're right. I mean, we don't have a daily show like they have in the States. We don't have the spitting image that we once had, etc., etc. You're so right, there's more of that. But even without that, you're quite right that some of the worst moments in politics are when there's a real harshness. There's it's something like the Prime Minister castigating the leader of the opposition for going to Calais to talk to a bunch of migrants. I have to say I try to be grown up and calm in life, but that really tested me. Whatever your views on how this crisis should be tackled and who should open their doors to how many people, is it really acceptable that coarseness, that harshness, that hatred? You went to talk to a bunch of migrants. And I, of course, was descended from migrants, but only 2. Because that's all it takes, Prime Minister. There you go, there's a joke. There we go.
Linda from Eastbourne. So just a comment regarding taking up points about the Green Party. Would Shami consider that to advance the Green movement overall and stop the erosion of our political and civil liberties, if the Corbyn Labour left and the Green Party have now taken on, basically, I think, taken over from many of the former Labour voters on the left, and now offer a very comprehensive platform of policies which is continually in development, hence the massive green surge in the last election. Would the two combine, should they come together to create a new political, environmental, social justice movement which could perhaps have enormous electoral success? I think it's important we get away from the Green Party as campaigning mainly on environmental issues. We really should accept they are now campaigning across the spectrum on environmental justice. And as I say, I believe they've really taken over from the Labour Party in many regards, who have now moved to the right. But Corbynites and Green Party, a possible coalition.
Goodness me, who knows what? Look, surely this dialogue must be happening between people all over the country. Surely there is an opportunity for a broad-based movement at this time. Exactly how it might formulate in the future, I don't know. But it's the wonderful thing is that there are so many young people in particular who are impatient for change and don't want to be told, no, you can't tax the rich, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. They grew up, that they were born and bred in the Iraq War. They don't want to be lied to, and I think there's a real opportunity, and if that opportunity isn't taken, it doesn't really matter to some extent what the precise formulation of the broad coalition is, and what matters is that the opportunity is taken. If not, we risk sort of disillusioning a whole generation, and to their cost, to our cost, the cost of the planet. So I think one way or another you're onto something. I don't know quite how, but one way or another I think you're clearly onto something there.
So I've got Sam next, please, Jana.
Hi, thank you very much for everything you said. In a few weeks' time, we have quite a big binary choice to make. Do we leave the European Union or do we stay? And I don't know what your position on any of this is, but what I'd like to hear from you is what are the risks in terms of human rights, liberty, from a leave decision or even a remain, in terms of how the politics has changed?
I want to remain. But it's not been the most straightforward. I'm going to be honest, it's not been the most easy and straightforward thing, because in my work in human rights, I've sometimes seen a sort of mixed picture. I've been frustrated at things like the European arrest warrant that I think just parceled people around Europe without harmonised the the ability to drag people around Europe, but don't harmonise the police station protections or the fair trial protections. So I've been critical of some measures and some of the surveillance stuff and so on. So I have been critical of some of the policies of the EU and the lack of accountability and so on. But if you think about it, I've been critical of the UK government too. And I'm not trying to dismantle that. Ultimately, I'm an internationalist. And our international institutions, the UN, let alone the EU, are imperfect, but we need to make them better. We can't tear them down. You know, I'm a Democrat. You know, Parliament really frustrates me, but I'm not blowing it up. You know, so I feel that so many of the challenges, including the great environmental ones that the planet faces, require international solutions, and I can't bear to walk away from a family of nations that's capable of having some positive impact. So that's kind of how I feel about it. In terms of rights and freedoms, I think it'd be really bad for workers' rights, no question. We pull out of the EU, we know what the agenda of many of the Remainers is in relation to workers' rights. You know, whether it's maternity or equality or holiday pay or that's really scary. And then on the Human Rights Act piece, I'm worried that even if we stay, or perhaps especially if we stay, or one way or another actually, whether we stay or remain, the Conservative Party, currently in government, is going to be so internally cut up about the bitter campaign over Brexit that they'll use the scrapping of the Human Rights Act as a sort of sticking plaster to make the family feel good again. Do you see what I mean? So because Mr. Cameron can then reach out to Mr. Gove and they can all be hard-nosed Eurosceptics together, but around human rights. So they will keep us in a Europe for money and markets, but not a Europe for rights and freedoms and ordinary people and their values, which is why I rather prefer a sort of Jeremy Corbyn Europe than a Michael Gove or a David Cameron Europe, if you see what I mean.
Okay. So, Shami, you mentioned, you spoke very eloquently about the need to protect the Human Rights Act, and we totally endorse that. In fact, Friends of the Earth is part of that campaign for the reasons that you mention. But I wanted to ask about your views about the evolution of human rights. So we're already seeing clear overlap. So the Paris Agreement, for example, in the preamble talks about the impacts on climate change, on human rights of climate change. And we have in the past considered campaigning for a right to a healthy environment to be included in the Human Rights Act, but have held off because it's been under threat. So I suppose my question to you is, do you see a point where do you see conditions in which that campaign could be reignited, either because of a positive political development or just the necessity of the fact that, so you've mentioned refugees a number of times, that's something we're actively considering because of the climate impacts potentially there also?
You know, I'm very grateful to you for holding off seeking to amend the Human Rights Act to add environmental rights for the reason that you gave. Sometimes in a card game you have to stick and not twist because you know that those in power have no intention whatsoever of creating a progressive British Bill of Rights. That's completely clear. That's absolutely clear that if the government gets away with its so-called British Bill of Rights and Responsibilities, it will be to dilute rights, not to enhance them. However, that doesn't mean one should say that forever. You're quite right. And you mentioned two possibilities. One was the right political conditions, and the other was just a big enough crisis, which is how these things tend to happen. And I can conceive of both of those. I think a more progressive government with real commitment to the rights and freedoms in the convention, and that could be trusted to have a conversation about building on them. That would be one possibility. And the other, as you say, completely right. I mean, I am worried about the refugee convention. It's being dishonoured now in thought and word and deed in relation to people who are so obviously, post-war refugee convention refugees. How would it be applied or limited in the context of the refugees of climate change crisis? So there's a tactical thing for lawyers.
isn't there? On the one hand, I want to not be too negative about the possibilities of using litigation under the existing refugee convention, because we've got to use what we've got. But on the other hand, I think you're right, that inevitably at some point there will have to be something that broadens the definition of a convention refugee to include desperate people fleeing the results of climate change.
Hi, Kat Turner from the Isle of Man. Thanks so much for that talk. It was great. The world seems to be increasingly polarised into people who give a hoot about justice, whether it's environmental or social, and therefore are getting crosser and crosser, and people who don't, either because they're quite happy with their Xboxes or they're struggling so hard to keep up they've got no time to think about anything. I can't always tell which way the pendulum's swinging, because if you hang out with people who think like you think the world thinks like you. What do you think the general population is? How do you think that thought pattern's changing? Is there a swing to more justice, or is there an increasing passivity?
I think that people give a hoot. That my feeling from having been, an activist, relatively high profile, going around the country speaking to audiences, is that people do give a hoot. The question is, what are they going to do with it, and which way is the pendulum going to, are you going Trump or Sanders? But you do give a hoot. Do you know what I mean? And the danger for me is, at this moment, is not complacency. The danger is that anger and that frustration and that powerlessness goes to the wrong popular movement and not a progressive one. That's kind of my feeling about it. In Britain in recent years, for example, we've seen these great crises in trust in our institutions. Possibly it begins with the executive over weapons of mass destruction. By the way, my inquiry will report before Chilcot. Call a woman, you see, call a woman. If only. No, I'm glad not to have had that call, that's for sure. But yeah, so trust in government, massive knock because of Iraq. Trust in Parliament, massive knock. MPs expensive. Trust in those nice people, the bank managers, right? Those bank managers with the pins, they were looking after everybody's money, right? Can't trust them. Trust in the police, the Nezers, Hillsborough, and trust in journalism, phone hacking, etc. And yet we do need institutions. We do need institutions. So how do you rebuild trust? So I think people give a hoot. I think I sense frustration, anger. Sometimes people have come to places like this instead of political parties, but they do give a hoot. Or they go to a literature festival, or they go to wherever it is they go, but they've got a lot to say, and there's a lot that they're worried about and that they care about. The trick is to harness that energy and to some extent that anger into something positive and progressive, I think.
And Roger. Thanks. I really wanted to build on Kat's question. In terms of campaigning and Friends of the Earth, we're thinking about shifting focus from Westminster, Whitehall to other ways of achieving social change. Cities, popular mobilisation, local community action, working with other kinds of institutions. How does that thinking play out in your sector?
I think it's a fascinating and exciting idea that you don't always go to the national government if you can find sometimes better conditions and effective levers for change in City Hall rather than in Westminster. And why not? Why not? It was one of your colleagues, Liz, who said to me earlier, that cities by their nature are often potentially more collaborative, more open, more international than nation states. And you have to look at the way certain senior politicians have changed tack. From, on the one hand, wanting to be the mayor of London, where you have to be pro-immigration, pro-race relations, etc., to being a putative contender to lead the Conservative Party and be Prime Minister, and then you want to leave Europe and stop immigration and be rude about the president's Kenyan heritage, and anyway. But I think it's really creative. I think campaigning is a creative thing. And so one door shuts, look for the other one, and of course with the Green movement, as opposed to some extent civil liberties. There's a lot that you can do just with without legislation to some extent, if you can just encourage people who are big players, whether public or private sector players at whatever level, to change their behaviour and lead by example and so on. So I've not done as much of that. However, I have worked with, on occasion, the police and trade unions, and I have worked on trying to achieve change beyond Westminster and Whitehall. But it's really about the combination. It's about taking the palette and using what's going to work for a particular campaign at a particular moment. I think that's probably the truth of it.
There was a time, of course, when all the things that you spoke about, whether they were deaths in custody, police violence, were ignored. There was a sense of course, they were the voices of the black community, the most marginalised, they were the other. And of course, there were large sections of British society would never accept that Western liberal democracy would ever countenance torture, detention, the things that we saw and we continue to see. And of course, now we're living in a moment where 1,000 people died this week in the Mediterranean. Yet, of course, more people signed a petition about a gorilla in the United States than that. And that, of course, the experience that we're seeing around refugees speaks broader to probably the most thankless task in this country is to campaign around asylum rights. So within that, the idea of the other and rebuilding institutions, of course, in the Macpherson inquiry, we identified institutional racism was a bedrock of that otherness. So how would you think, as we move forward and try and rebuild some of these institutions, we can begin to tackle that deep institutional racism which is endemic as part of this society?
I think in the end we just have to keep reminding people that the powerful will divide and rule. Every time throughout history, powerful interests divide and rule, get people to turn on each other, whether it's on a council estate and some people are antisocial and unworthy and other people are worthy, or whether it's in the world on the basis of nationality or race. And we just have to keep banging on and reaching out to people and demonstrating what is so self-evidently true, that a handful of people own and plunder all the resources, and most other people, even people who think of themselves as very proudly middle class, have got everything to gain and nothing to lose from a more equal, less divided and othered planet, I think.
Hi, thank you for today. Your point about rebuilding trust and accountability surely goes along with us all having access to legal aid. No legal aid leads to no rights, leads to no access to justice, leads to the disintegration of the independent referral bar. Nice to see you back. And can you see how, bearing in mind that it seems that all the political parties have had a hand in the legal aid pot and in destroying it and in destroying people's access to it, so step away from all the politics, looking at the economic environment we're in, looking at what's happening to people and access to justice, how are we going to achieve it, how are we going to get a properly funded independent referral bar that doesn't have ABS structures and corporate situations and the corruption that goes with that. How do we get back to people being able to get a voice through justice?
The crumb of comfort that I offer on legal aid at this moment is that, and you're quite right, the three main, whatever that means these days, but the Labour Party, the Lib Dems under the coalition, and the Conservatives have all played their part in dismantling legal aid. My crumb of comfort is that I have now joined a new iteration of the Labour Party that is led by people who stood with me throughout on demonstrations against legal aid and have whatever you think of them on other issues, people like Jeremy and Diane have got a very proud record on legal aid. And if there is a moment to try and persuade a major political party to commit to decent legal aid provision, this is potentially that moment. Now, how exactly the policy should look, how it should be designed, I don't know the answer to all of that, but this is the moment for doing that work and doing that lobbying. I would argue to people who agree. I think there was sometimes a day, it all started with calling us all BMW driving legal aid lawyers. That was the whole Blair straw thing, and it ends up with just desperate, vulnerable people who are losing their homes and they don't get access to legal advice, or they're losing access to their children with no legal advice. It was presented as sort of a gravy train. Do you remember the gravy train for fat cat? This is all Tony Blair, by the way, a lawyer himself. He started it with all of that language. But it's not about lawyers and it's not about fat cats. It's about people who are going through desperate times in their lives, particularly in an economic crisis or in austerity, who don't have basic advice and representation. And that's the truth of it. And now that we've seen it, goodness me, the hard way, we've got a potential window of opportunity to design a new legal aid system and get a major political party to commit to it, I think. And the judges would support that too, in my view, because they have to pick up the pieces of desperate, unrepresented people appearing in their courts, and they don't like it. They don't like it either, in my view.
Hi, Shami. It's Simon at the back here. It's related to Kat and Assad's question. So globally, refugee crises are going to get worse because of climate change. And related to that, immigration is a big political issue and will remain so here in Britain. And there's a huge danger of racist, intolerant responses. Do you think that Friends of the Earth should campaign more on this issue? And if you do, what specifically should we do?
I think there's obviously a need for broad coalitions in support of refugees in general. And Assad was quite right that this is the most, for years now, it's been one of the most demonised groups of humanity in the country. And, we now don't even call them, first they were refugees when I grew up in the 80s, and refugee was a noble word. That great progressive President Reagan, I think, went to Bergen-Belsen and made a famous speech in 1986 or something about, I am a refugee, we're all refugees, and solidarity with refugees because they were coming from the Soviet bloc, and they made us feel good about ourselves in the free West, and they were defecting spies or ballet dancers and whatever, right? So that was fine until the first aeroplane of, Tamil refugees landed at Heathrow Airport, and suddenly, so then they stopped being refugees and started being asylum seekers, and then the word bogus was added, and now migrant is apparently the word, as in bunch of or whatever. I think it's really important that there is for the moment, a broad coalition of people who want to help humanise the dehumanised people. And then longer term, Friends of the Earth can probably lead the way in the work that Geeta was describing about how you begin to litigate under the current refugee convention, not just in Britain but elsewhere, and how you prepare to design what the next refugee convention is going to have to look like to deal with climate change.
Great, goodness. Well, we've had some fantastic questions there. Shami, you'll be pleased to know. I mean, you heard some questions there from definitely the most dangerous woman in Hull, and there's a lot of people in this tent who are the most dangerous men and women in their localities. So you've got some real sisters and brothers here today. So no surprise you got the reaction you did. Shami, incredibly grateful for you coming along and speaking to us today. Just a couple of things you said are worth us reflecting on, I think, and I want to pull out. And it's partly, I'm nervous this is partly my own confirmation bias, because confirming things I said last night in a speech last night, but I'm just going to rub them in, therefore. You were saying how we are social creatures and how actually, building that friendship between people in common movements, that's how we build movements. And I was saying last night, for Friends of the Earth to go from good to great, we've got to dial up the friends in Friends of the Earth. We've got to recognise exactly that there were social animals, and actually putting the effort into the social connections is what make us stronger and achieve change. And you also talked about that focus on next generation. And actually, we've just adopted an organisational goal, a new strategy, which is all about saying our vision is that in 15 years' time, the next generation will be enjoying an environment that's getting better. It's not one that's just not quite as bad as it would have been otherwise, but actually one that's getting better. And we didn't liaise beforehand, so I just wanted to really pick that up. It's really chimes. There's so much we can learn from history, and you've talked a lot about history in your talk here. And we've got a book coming out very soon, Campaigning for Change, Lessons from History. This is from the Big Ideas Project, where we've worked with historians, really trying to look at campaigns across a whole range of issue areas, everything from campaigning against slavery, campaigning for homosexual rights, and campaigning around the miners' strike, and so on. Because it's really important, if we're going to have even better campaigns in the future at Friends of the Earth, let's learn from campaigns in the past. And to your question, Pat, about pendulum swings, where we are, I think one of the things you really learn from this is that social change never happens in a nice linear way. You get a surge of support for something and does really well for a bit, and then there's an inevitable pushback. You know, it was only once the anti-slavery movement was doing well that a pro-slavery movement formed. And it's when we were doing really well on getting climate change on the agenda, it was only then that you had the climate skeptics come out. This is actually all just natural. What history shows is it's a bit like change happens like waves on a beach. So you have a rapid surge of change comes in, and then it rolls back a bit, and another one comes in. And our job as campaigners is you can't resist the fact that you get those cycles. It's just to make sure that each time a wave comes in, it goes up a bit higher up the beach, and each time it goes out, it doesn't go quite as far as before. So look out for this book when it comes out. But we don't just learn from history about how to campaign, we can also learn from other sectors and so on. And Shami, what's been fantastic having you here today is to bring those lessons from your amazing campaigning on human rights over the last 12 years, and longer really, to see what we can learn, where the interlinkages are with our agenda, and absolutely learn from you, and to see how we can be even better with our campaigns going forward. So thank you so much for coming here today, coming to a place called Hope, and giving us a great deal of hope in the process as well. Let's give a very big thank you to Shami Chakrabarti.